Hey, everybody. Happy Tuesday to you all. Welcome to another episode of Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I am your host, Dan Besbris, and today we're going to be getting into wings. The delicious, delicious wings. Boneless, bone-in, also Old Man Squatty wings from this past year. And what, again, we can learn from that insanity. And it was intriguing to me as I went through and set this one up. And I'll throw the graphic up on the board for those that are hanging out with us in a little bit. It occurred to me that the Old Man Squad was like really heavily centers this year. And I don't know why that didn't land until not the center review, because we were doing the center review and I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is taking 2 days. But now until we did the guards yesterday and the wings today, when I looked at it and was like, oh my God, we had what, 6 guards. Today, we're only looking at 5 wings. And then there were like 13 centers or something like that. We need to do a little bit of a reassessment, I think is basically the thing. Now, there are also the games cap darlings, which was 1 center out of 4. Although the not so boring swing was Chet Holmgren. That was a center. The totals guys, there were 6 of them, and only 1 of those guys was a center. So at least there was a little bit of a tipping back towards normal. But I do think that before we get into the wings today that we're going to break down on the show, it's worth noting why the Old Man Squad ended up with so many centers on the board. And this is really important. So I hope your ears have perked up. This is important because it doesn't mean that you have to go out there and get all of the centers on the Old Man Squad. I'll say it again. Just because there were more centers on our list this past season than guards and wings doesn't mean you need to go out and get all of those centers. It doesn't even mean that you should be overloaded on centers. What it meant was that simply this, that there were more undervalued centers on the board this past season than guards and wings. And in fact, what it likely actually means is that you probably need to get your guard and wing targets because there just aren't as many. And you can kind of look and see where they were. Like we talked about, Melton and Conley were at 109 and 115 on yesterday's show. So you had an opportunity to get some guards late. Only 1 wing had an ADP, at least of our target board. Only 1 wing on our target board had an ADP outside the top 90. At least in these non-totals or game cap darlings. Actually, just the totals guys. Austin Reeves, who I guess shooting guard. The only wing with an ADP outside the top 90 was Josh Hart. We'll talk about him a little bit later on today's show. He'll actually be the last player we talk about. This is actually incredibly important stuff because, and look, we'll have our Old Man Squad list again for this coming season. Reminder, that doesn't mean the players have to be old. It just has to do with the way that they build out their fantasy value and why it creates this sort of almost predictable undervaluing of certain types of players. Not old necessarily, but maybe a little bit boring. So we'll set up our board for this coming season, just like we always do. And we'll see what names populate it. Is it going to have, 12 centers and only 11 combined guards and forwards again? Okay, well, that's good to know. We'll know where we can attack certain types of players. This is all critical news. And we're going to look at this stuff in a bunch of different ways. More this year than ever before, partially because, again, we got a brand new podcast feed to tip into. But maybe more importantly, forget the new podcast feed. Why? I mean, yes, don't forget it. Please like, rate, subscribe to it. But the big difference for me this coming season, and I say this just as matter-of-factly as humanly possible, is that I'm not part now of an organization selling anything. Make of that what you will. Good, bad, ugly, whatever. Just statement of fact, I can do more. So expect a lot of stuff as we roll towards the start of this season. Quick reminder once again, everybody, that if you're watching or listening after the fact, there will be no social media live streams going forward, except for, I would think, very specific types of events, maybe like, Q&A type shows, stuff like that. So if you want to take in Old Man Squad content, you have to subscribe to it, either on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, whatever other RSS feed you can hunt down. Any place podcasts are located. Please do take a moment to like, rate, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Which, I did it. I did the all that good stuff thing. Like the video on YouTube or a tweet I put out. I'll be very specific here. Subscribe on one of those platforms. And if you share on one of those platforms, well, then I will love you for exactly 24 hours until the next show comes out and I ask you to do it again. All right, there's the wings. There were only 5 of them, guys. There were only 5 wings/forwards that we had on the Old Man Squad this past year. 2 of them, one of them was a train wreck. One of them was not great. And I would argue 3 of them ranged from pretty darn good to extraordinary. Overall, I'd say I'm pretty satisfied with the hit rate there. The only beef I have is the first name on the list, and that's Jimmy Butler, because that one actually cost some draft capital. Not the most draft capital, but enough. And for Butler, who only played in 60 games this year, not the big surprise there. The big surprise with Jimmy was that he was only number 27 in 9-cat this season, while also playing in 60 games. He generally went in the 3rd round, so it wasn't like you were spending, a top 25 pick on him generally. Although, who knows with some of this stuff, ADPs can get a little bit wonky. What was Butler's ADP? Like late 26? Something like that. All right, so you had to spend an early 3rd on him, which is probably where I got him in 1 or 2 places. And, he didn't completely blow up your fantasy season. You got him at 25, 26. He finished at 27. The problem is that with a guy like Butler, the reason you took him at 25 was, look, I want a guy who's a top 14 per game player who I know is going to miss a bunch of ball games. He's a roto guy, and frankly, probably belonged in the games cap darling section of my list. And frankly, I have no idea how he got out of it. That's a dramatic and gross oversight by yours truly. I thought he was going to be number 11 on a per game basis. I thought he was going to play in about 65, 66 games. And so by totals, I figured he'd be also quite close to that mark. But as it turned out, he missed a few games more than expected. And the big thing was his per game numbers just weren't as good this year. His field goal attempts per game were down, back around where they were his first season in Miami, 13 roughly. Still shot 50% and added half a three-pointer this year, so that was good. He actually shot 41% from downtown this season on extremely low volume. Free throws were still very good, around 8 per ball game, a little bit lower than seasons past. That kind of went with the usage thing, but 86% there, so still pretty darn good. Rebounds also a little bit lower at 5.3 instead of closer to 6. This was, again, more like the pre-Miami Jimmy Butler. 5 assists, fine, not a big fluctuation there. Turnovers still relatively low. And then we get to the big one. The big one was steals. Career 1.6 steals per game guy in 33 minutes a game. Hasn't, frankly, been around hasn't been lower than 1.6 since his second season in the NBA, and he had just 1.3 this year. After 1.8 last year, 1.6 the year before that, 2.1 his second season in Miami, and 1.8 in the year that the bubble year. 1.8 the year before that. Split season, mostly in Philadelphia. We'll ignore the Minnesota 10 games, but he did have 2.5 steals a game in those 10. In many of the year before that, he was at 2. Chicago seasons, 1.9, 1.6, 1.8, 1.9. So the 1.3 really came out of nowhere. And you could argue that he's starting to get older, which, fair. He'll be 35 in September this season. But, age 34 season, you could expect maybe some erosion, but significant. I mean, we're talking about a pretty darn significant drop-off in the steals category, which, oftentimes you do see that take a hit as guys age a little bit, but it doesn't usually happen all at once the way that it did this year after, again, having a high above his own average steals season the previous year. So, yes, Jimmy Butler was a little bit of a letdown. He didn't ruin your fantasy team, not by a long shot. I mean, a guy that you draft at 25 who finishes at 27, especially in a games cap format, you're kind of like, slight disappointment. But what it does do, while we, again, admit to taking a slight haircut there, the ADP, I guess, when I built this was 23, by the way, for those that are watching, if you're wondering what that number is there. It was 25, 26, at the end of the preseason. But remember, I did this week out. It was a week before the season started, something like that. So he was trending in the downward direction. And that usually means that you can actually get him beyond where it ends up. So like the ADP trended towards 25, and it probably meant that he was going more like 27, 28. Doesn't matter. Even if you got the per game, even if his ADP matched his per game performance, that was not why you drafted Jimmy Butler. It's fair to say that this one was a miss, even if it didn't obliterate your fantasy team. But what I think it does do, at least in terms of like a learning process here, number one, he should not be, he should never have made it into the regular old man squad. He always should have been a games cap darling. And he will be. He will be. In any scenarios going forward. And I say that because I think he will be. I think Jimmy Butler probably ends up right back on the old man squad this coming. I don't know for sure. It's June 11th after all. But I think there's a reasonable chance he does for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think there's an okay shot that his steals come back up a little bit. 1.3 was extraordinarily low. He just didn't have those games where he was getting a bunch of them. I mean, I guess you could try to argue that team makeup changed it a little bit, but the team makeup didn't really change all that much. Miami didn't get like some key component this year that they didn't have before. They brought in Terry Rozier halfway through, but he was hurt for a bunch of his Miami time, and that didn't change what Jimmy Butler was doing. Nor should it. He just wasn't getting steals on defense this year. So this was kind of, from a per game standpoint, sort of a worst case scenario. There are a lot of ways that Butler could improve. One thing we want to be careful of when we start talking early here in June is, Miami could turn up another key guy. It could go some other direction, in the non-Terry Rozier division. And then Butler's usage could potentially take even another incremental hit. Tyler Hero can't really seem to stay healthy, so maybe he does for a year, and that puts a little small hit into Butler again. But I think you got to believe that the steals come back to 1.5, 1.6 range, maybe more. And so if Butler slips from where he went this last year, because people are like, oh, I drafted Jimmy Butler at 25, and he didn't hit my marks. I was frustrated by his season. He probably goes closer to 30 next year. I mean, think about it. Butler is going near 25 perennially. This was like the earliest he'd been drafted in a couple of seasons. No one ever really believed that he was just going to keep doing it. And finally, he didn't this year. So, kudos to the rest of y'all, I guess. But he was a hit for like 4 years in a row. Missing a handful of games, like usual. So, roto-y, games cappy. But beating his ADP at the top of the board by a round or more, That's extraordinarily useful. And I think he'll have a shot to do that again. I bet Jimmy Butler's ADP is in the 27 to 33 range this coming season. And I would probably take him there because 27 per game feels like kind of about as bad as it gets. Next name on the board with an ADP of 63 was Jalen Johnson. Excuse me, Jalen Williams, not Jalen Johnson. Jalen Williams. There's so many Jalens in the NBA. Apologies, everyone. Jalen Williams, who got off to a slow start this year and then went buck wild after that. He finished at number 42 on a per game basis. I had him at 39 as our per game ranking. So I'm going to just call that exactly right. If you're off by 3, you got it. I had his totals rank at 21 because I figured he'd play in most basketball games. I was a little bit off there. He only played in 71 out of 82 basketball games this year, which I thought he would be, more like 74, 75-ish. But again, it's hard to complain about the season that Jalen Williams had. He finished at 36 by total. So regardless of how you cut this thing, his ADP of 63 got steamrolled on all sides by 2 rounds on the per game side, almost by about 2.5 rounds by totals. And that is, again, despite a slow start. Remember, he got off to a slow start this year. He was probably the largest buy low recommendation I've ever given out on a podcast. There were actually a number of them. I think Jimmy Butler was in like the 50s for a while, and I was like, that's a buy low. And Jalen Williams was in the 90s, and I was like, guys, this is your maximum power buy low. Do whatever you can. And then he rolled it like a top 25 clip the rest of the year after that. Jalen Williams finished. By the way, I didn't give you Jimmy Butler's numbers this year. Not that it really matters, I guess, but I probably should get in the habit of that. Jimmy Butler was at 20.8 points per game, a 3-pointer, 5.3 boards, 5 assists, 1.3 steals, 0.3 blocks, and 50-86 splits, 1.7 turnovers. Jalen Williams was at 19 points per game, 1.5 3-pointers, 4 boards, 4.5 assists, 1.1 steals, 0.6 blocks, and 81.5 splits, although lower volume on free throw than Butler, but also an exactly even 1.7 turnovers per game. I look at Jalen Williams, who, by the way, was like the world's easiest call on guy you should target in that range. Just mind-boggling that he would ever fall that far in a competitive league. And generally, he didn't. I'm looking at the draft results, even from a public league that I'm in. He went at 55. So it was still 7-8 slots before then. I'm a little sad because he was the guy I was targeting, and he went off the board 2 picks before my spot. But luckily for me, I got James Harden at 57 in this league. There was literally like an entire round's worth of players that I wanted with my 5th round pick in this Yahoo Public League. This is a boat racing. But as far as Jalen Williams goes, it actually, at least in my eyes, I think there's more that he can do. That's not to say that he will, because this is a guy who second half of last year was inside the top 40. Usage went up this season, 10.5 shots a game last year, 14 shots a game this year. Rebounds actually went down because he was using his energy on other stuff. But, the positive impact field goal percent became a larger positive. The assists went up. Steals went down from 1.4 to 1.1. I still think that's a number. The same story as Jimmy Butler. You see steals fluctuate a little bit on a year-to-year basis. The fact that Jalen Williams only had 80 steals this season, I thought was kind of surprising because he is really a very good steals guy in general. So I would say when you look at Jalen Williams and you look at the Thunder and whether, if they bring in a high usage guy, then that kind of changes the board a little bit. But it looked this year, at least to me, like Jalen Williams came into his own, and 14 shots a game is almost the bare minimum for next year. I don't know about replicating 54% shooting. Maybe he does it again. He shot 43% from 3-point land, which is damn impressive. Steals would be the reason I'd invest in Jalen Williams as early as you're probably going to have to. No, we talked about it yesterday. We have some results from an early mock that the industry guys put together. And I'm trying to figure out, where did Jalen Williams go in this one? I mean, we can look at where Jimmy Butler went also. Jalen Williams, this is a 14-teamer, third or fifth pick of the third round. So 28, 9, 30, 1, 2, 3. He went at 33, which, I mean, that's pretty freaking pricey. When he finished at 42 this year, and, you could play the whole, like, how did he do over the final couple of months of the season game? He was number 28 over his last 25 ball games because the steals were back at 1.5. And that's really the difference for him between early 40s and late 20s. 1 steal versus 1.5. Everything else was almost exactly the same. Shooting or field goal percent was actually a little bit lower. Boards and assists and steals were a tiny bit higher. It doesn't really matter which Jalen Williams you think you're going to get. The last 2 months of this year, Jalen Williams is probably the Jalen Williams you're hoping for next year. So if 28, 25 probably would be like the best case scenario, unless he suddenly decides to take 17 shots a game, which I don't think is about to happen. If 25 is a best case scenario, drafting him at 33 is creating kind of a razor thin margin to cash in. Not to say it can't happen, but you don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. Still, I love his game. I love his fantasy game. We got to win, a big win on him this year, and maybe you get another one next year. Interestingly, by the way, if we're talking about the results of that Roto mock, you know who went way later than Jalen Williams? Jimmy freaking Butler, who went close to 50 in this draft. Yeah, I know. I don't think that's going to be the case in real life. I thought, what did I just say a few minutes ago? Early 30s? Maybe I'm going too early. Maybe he falls all the way back near 40, in which case I'll have Jimmy Butler on every damn team on planet Earth. Maybe not all my head-to-head teams, but certainly the others. Here's the big miss. Got to wear it. Cam Johnson. He was terrible this year. Absolute dog do. The Brooklyn Nets as a team were dog do this year, and it trickled down to all of their fantasy assets. Cam Johnson, number 129 on a per-game basis. Worse than that by totals, if you can believe it. 44.5% from the field, 79% at the free throw line. He only played 27.5 minutes per ball game. Some of that was injury. Some of that was rotations. He has a shot to be sort of like a post-type kind of guy next year, but I need to see a big change in the roster makeup for Brooklyn, because that was, I mean, everybody was awful. The only guy on the Brooklyn Nets who you could point at and say, oh, I guess that guy outperformed expectations was Cam Thomas. Nick Claxton was a miss. Cam Johnson was a miss. Mikal Bridges was a miss. If you went anybody, basically, on Brooklyn, they went the wrong direction. What's the lesson to learn here? It's hard to say, because going into the season, I don't think we could know that there was just going to be horrible vibes in Brooklyn after like the first 3 weeks of the year. And then everybody was annoyed. Everybody was frustrated. Nobody got as many touches as they wanted. Cam Thomas came in and took 21 shots a game, and everybody else was just like, wait a minute, well, don't I get to also? No, you do not. Thomas improved in his passing later in the year, but by that point, half the team was hurt. Mikal Bridges was playing games just to keep an Iron Man streak alive, but they were non-competitive. It's going to take a lot, actually, to convince me to jump back on any kind of Brooklyn bandwagon. For fantasy purposes, at least. I still like Cam Johnson's fantasy game. I don't think what we saw this year was a good representation of who he is now. But woof. Woof. He went at 72 in this Yahoo league that I'm looking at. But, I mean, look at the drop-off. In his 25 games in Brooklyn last year after he got traded, he took 12 shots a game and shot 47% on them. 16.6 points per game, 4.8 boards, 2 assists. He was at 1.7 combined defensive stats. He took 3.5 free throws a game at 85%, which with the direction, frankly, that he was trending in his career. And this year, I mean, I don't know. 44.6 is his career shooting, but you got to do sort of like an early season versus later. I mean, he's only been in the NBA for 6 years. 5 years? 5 years. But, first 2 seasons, he shot 42 and change combined. And his last 3 seasons, he's been up about 46, 47%. So field goal percent was down. Free throw percent was way down. Worst mark of his career by a lot. Rebounds were fine. Pretty normal. Assists were normal. Turnovers were normal. Steals were way down on a per minute basis in particular. Although, I don't think the expectation was that he had 1.4 steals in his 31 minutes in Brooklyn last year. I don't think that was the number you were gunning for. You're probably looking for 1.1, 1.2 in starters minutes, but he didn't even get starters minutes. They just went another way. If I'm going to get back on Cam Johnson at any point while he's in Brooklyn, I need somebody out of the way. And not just Ben Simmons. That wasn't enough because I still don't expect Ben Simmons to ever play basketball again. We need, I don't know, Dorian Finney-Smith out of the way or Cam Thomas out of the way or something. Cam Thomas isn't going anywhere, by the way. So in all likelihood, this is probably just one where you're like, you know what? Move on. Don't do it again. Ugh. That one was bad. But luckily, we followed it up with another solid one. Hooray! Solid one. And that was longtime logo of the Dan Besbris Old Man Squad. Founding member of the Bobby and Toby podcast, Tobias Harris, who went back to having good numbers again with James Harden gone. That one was pretty freaking predictable. James Harden ruined Tobias Harris. Absolutely ruined him. Took all of his everything away. Sapped him of his strength. Tobias Harris had an ADP of 87 when I put this list together. And if I recall, I think it was going the other way. Yeah, he finished the preseason at 90 and a half. ADP of 90. That was a walk in the park kind of pick. He finished at 17 points, 6.5 boards, 3 assists, a steal, 0.7 blocks, 1.3 threes on good percentages. Just quality, decent numbers in almost all 9 categories this year. Tobias Harris, he wasn't all that far off from being a 9 cat positive. He was like a half an assist and about 0.3 3-pointers away from basically being a positive impact player or neutral impact guy in everything. That's kind of impressive. Plus, he was a nice positive in free throws, good positive in turnovers. Rebounds were useful. Better than average in points. Not by much, but by some. Everybody's talking about what an unbelievable season Jalen Johnson had, and they should. But you know who was ranked 2 slots away? Tobias Harris. And nobody's talking about it. Now, if Philly goes out and reels in a Paul George or Jimmy Butler or some sort of big name guy, then yeah, obviously you just don't even think about it. I think Tobias Harris, is he officially off the books now? Let's double check that thing. I think he's a free agent, and Philadelphia fans hated him because he went full disappearing act in a lot of spots. Look, not going to sugarcoat it. He went through long stretches where he was an insufferable player to watch and roster on fantasy, but when the season all rolls together, he was top 50. And there's something that's fun about a guy doing it quietly. I don't know where Tobias Harris is going to end up, but just remember, he was top 50 this year on 13.5 shots per game. He's probably at the stage of his career where he's going to be a smaller impact role player. Like, no one's going to go out and give Tobias Harris a massive contract right now to go be a feature part of their offense. But, he was a 3rd, 4th option in Philadelphia, and those are the numbers he was able to put up. So if we're going to simplify this thing, and that is what we generally try to do on Old Man Squad fantasy basketball, simplify handicapping for fantasy basketball. Simplifying the Tobias Harris situation is saying, okay, look, he's behind Joel Embiid. He's behind Tyrese Maxey in Philly this year. He was probably slightly ahead of, like a Kelly Oubre or somewhere in that neck of the woods. But Embiid took 22 shots a game. Maxey was at 20. Now, some of that was with Joel out. He was, more like 18, 19 with Joel Embiid around. However you want to cut it, top two guys were around 40 shots a game on the 76ers. So, let's say Tobias Harris goes someplace where he's a third option. It's very possible he goes to a place where he's a third option who gets to do more than he did this season. 13 and a half shots a game is enough for Tobias Harris. It's enough. Honest to goodness, he was a tough player to roster last year because he was just so freaking boring. And he only took 11 and a half shots per game. Shout out James Harden for ruining his fantasy numbers. But despite that, he was still pretty much borderline fantasy useful even last year. People are going to point to Tobias Harris last season and say it was an absolute disaster of a year. And yes, he had a very good first half and a really ugly second half. But he was number 60 last season, not this season where he was inside the top 50. He was number 60 on 11 and a half shots per game. That's all it took. He can get that almost anywhere he goes. The last time he didn't get 11 shots per game was with Orlando for half of the 2015-2016 season. He took exactly 11 that year. But he was still at 14, 7, and 2 with 1.6 defensive stats. He's since, by the way, fixed his free throw stroke. So kind of a different guy now. But you give him starters minutes, he's going to get you one steal. He's going to get you half a block. He's going to get you probably 15 to 18 points, 1 to 1.5 3-pointers, average rebounds for a forward, decent assists for a forward, and he'll probably beat his ADP again because he's Tobias Harris. He has what I think you can now refer to as the D'Angelo Russellitis, where he gets blamed for stuff, even if it's not really his fault. His job wasn't supposed to be big enough for him to take the blame. That's basically what D'Angelo Russellitis is. D'Lo-itis. Where your blame is outsized to your expected role. Oh, D'Lo. It was D'Lo's fault the Lakers fell apart. Not really. If that's the reason the team can't cut it, then there are larger problems. Same story for Philly. If the reason that Philly slumped for stretches was Tobias Harris went into a shell, other problems exist. And look, I'm more than willing to admit he goes through stretches where he's not good. That's not the question here. It's whether or not he gets the right amount of blame or credit. He gets minimal credit and a lot of blame as a third or fourth option. It's very weird. People love to hate D'Lo and Tobias Harris. Why it's their fault, I don't entirely understand. But the nice thing is, for Tobias, because his fantasy game is so freaking quiet, where he's just league average in everything, that's a winning formula in fantasy basketball. So sure, keep hating him, everybody. I got no problem with that. Hate away. Because he'll keep getting drafted between 80 and 110, and we'll just keep doing it. Last name we're going to talk about today is Josh Hart, who had an ADP of 119. He was a little bit more of a flyer pick this season. And thanks to an array of trades and injuries and things of that nature, Josh Hart ended up being a really, really nice play. Not all season long, though. All season long, he was number 124 in 9-cat. So he was right on his ADP. He played in 81 out of 82 regular season games this year. So by totals, he absolutely beat the daylights out of that marker. He was number 77 by totals. But the real story with Josh Hart, and everybody that watched fantasy basketball year knows exactly what I'm about to say, is as the Knicks started to lose players to injury, and it happened over and over and over again, Josh Hart stepped his game up. And over the second half of the season, he was a top 65 fantasy play. His last 30 games, he averaged 12.5 points, 11 rebounds from that small forward spot, 5.5 assists, 1.1 steals, 1 3-pointer, 45-78 splits. Were not all that great, but who cares when your wing is averaging 12.5, 11, 5.5, and 1.5 defensive stats with a 3-pointer. He was awesome the second half of the year. He was an early 6th rounder the second half of the year. The lesson here is you could point and you could say, yeah, Dan, you got a little bit lucky with this call. And that's frankly kind of accurate because first 2 months of the season, Josh Hart probably ended up on most waiver wires because people were like, I can't wait on this dude to figure out where he sits in the whatever this current iteration. Because they brought in Dante DiVincenzo. Those two guys were kind of fighting each other. And then guys went down. But here's the thing. This is a Tibbs team. Guys always go down. Frankly, I thought Josh Hart was going to be one of the guys who went down. He turned out to not be one. But Julius Randle went down. They traded for Anunoby, who went down almost immediately. That team was actually very good when OG was healthy. Mitchell Robinson went down. Didn't really have a big impact on Josh Hart, but didn't have no impact on Hart because then they rolled Hartenstein at center and Jericho Sims is terrible. So sometimes they'll go smaller. Everybody that went down for that Knicks team helped Josh Hart, but it was also somewhat predictable. Someone on the Knicks, someone on a Tom Thibodeau team, someone's, it's probably plural, is going to get hurt. Because dudes just can't play. Like Josh Hart, the second half of the season, basically played 40 minutes a game. He had multiple games where he never came out. So did freaking Deuce McBride. These guys were playing a full 48. Josh Hart pretty much played a full 48 every day in the playoffs this year. What was the actual final? Like, here, we got to look this up because it's so freaking funny. Josh Hart. Let's look up a playoff minutes per game number. You thought the regular season was funny. How about the postseason? Josh Hart postseason this year. Knicks played how many games did they actually play? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They beat Philly in 6. They lost to Indy in 7. So 13 playoff games. Josh Hart played every minute of the playoff games the Knicks had in 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 13. Literally did not come off the floor. One of those was an overtime loss. He played all 53 minutes of that game. Against Indiana, he came out. Against Indiana, he came out of the basketball game from time to time. Against Philly, actually, the first 2 games against Indiana, he played all 48. Against Philly, he did it 2 out of the 6 games, played all 48. One of them, he played 46 and a half. And another one, he played 45 minutes and 40 seconds. Like, yeah, duh. Guys are not going to survive this type of thing. And I get that that's not the usual thing for the Knicks. They tried. They really did try to keep the minutes a little bit lower for, like, I don't know, Jalen Brunson, who played 35 and a half. Not an overwhelming number, thank the good Lord. But it's a feature, not a bug, is the old expression for stuff like this. For Tom Thibodeau coached teams, guys are going to get run into the ground. That's just how it goes. We don't know when. Will it all be the first year? Randall survived it for a while. And even this year it was a shoulder. It wasn't like a nagging knee injury that knocked him out. But you could also point to just say, look, if guys are on the floor more and going full bore more, you're also more prone to get hurt, even if it's not a injury of playing time. Okay, so how do you treat a situation like this going forward? Well, if you think someone's going to step into a big role, you kind of have 2 different formats. There's the head-to-head side where you're like, look, can I survive a guy putting up top 130, 140 kind of numbers for basically indefinitely and hope that something tilts my way? Generally, the answer is no in a situation like that. Roto, I think it's an easier play to make when you're like, look, it's the Al Horford. It's what we talked about with Alex Rickling. One guy goes down, any one guy, basically, in this team except center, pretty much. And you got this step-in dude. DeAnthony Melton was that guy for Philly. Anybody besides center went down, he stepped in. We talked about Al Horford. Literally anyone on the roster went down, he stepped in. I think Rickleen brought up George Niang in Cleveland, although his fantasy ceiling wasn't quite as high. But, Josh Hart, okay, can I squat on this sixth man until he becomes fantasy relevant? And in a games cap format, the answer is often sure. If you have a 3-man bench, it's a harder call because you're going to need to get those guys in pretty regularly. But in the leagues that I run, at least the Roto leagues I run, I have a 5-player bench. No injured list because I don't think it's necessary in a games cap format. Why the hell do you need an IL if you can just put a guy on a bench? You don't, by the way. You don't. You absolutely do not. Because a 5-player bench is more than enough. But that's one where you could just squat on a guy like a Josh Hart and say, you know what, at some point this year, a month, 2 months in, 3 months in, whatever it is, someone's going down because it's the NBA. It doesn't even have to be a Tom Thibodeau team. Every team has an injury at some point. The odds are just higher that it's coming sooner on a team that Tom Thibodeau is in charge of. But every single team had some kind of injury this year. There's always one team that kind of dodges it. I don't even know if there was one this season. Like last year, Sacramento was almost completely healthy the entire year. And then, of course, this season, guys missed a few games here and there. Not as many as you'd think. Like the key guys were still basically there. But everybody misses something. So then if you're in a games cap format, you can just treat it like an injury stash. All right, Josh Hart, I'm going to treat you like you're injured until you're not, until you're playing. Is that a reasonable strategy with a 10th round pick? Because that's basically what this ADP suggested at 119. Questionable. Funny thing, too, with Josh Hart, even though his full season ranking was lower than his ADP, I think people are going to still treat him as a massive win. Not because of the totals rank, but because of that second half surge. And I don't know if that's fair. I don't know that we should give ourselves a ton of credit on this one, other than to, again, kind of point out, look, you knew at some point he was going to get to do a little bit more. The question was when, and would it be enough to counterweight the times when he did not? And that is your program here on this lovely Tuesday, June the 11th. This is Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I'm Dan Besbris. Please, Lord, somebody, if you're listening, watching, whatever, click the little button on YouTube, subscribe, click the button no matter where you're listening. And if you have a second to drop a 5-star review, I really, really would appreciate it. I know a lot of you are like, oh, I did this on your old feed. Yep, we need it again, friends and confidants. We need it again. Make it so. It's the only way we can grow. I'm Dan Besbris, at Dan Besbris on Twitter, at Old Man Squad over on Twitter. If you want to follow the feed of our full umbrella, some few hundred of you have done that already, so that's fun. Shows are dropping over on the Old Man Squad feed, and more are coming. If you want to be a part of what we're growing here, hit me up on Twitter at Dan Besbris. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. We'll do it again tomorrow. We'll get into the totals, guys, tomorrow, I think. Wrap up the Old Man Squad, maybe? Finally get it done? The hell with it.